Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us in tonight's session of Why Marx. We want to take a look at what Marx and particularly Engels had to say on the question of war, which is, of course, always interesting in general, but with the threat of World War III hanging over us, does take a particular interesting perspectives on it. We want to discuss what they said about it, how it can form what socialists say on the issue today, and perhaps even when and where we should get involved as socialists in a war. And Engels certainly had a lot of practice on that front, as Ian Spencer will now discuss.
I took this one on because there was a wee gap in the schedule, and it was something that had been promised for some time, and I felt that it was, particularly in the light of what's going on in Ukraine and what may well happen in China in the future, it's essential that we start to have a think about what Marx and Engels said about war. I'll start maybe in a way which is not quite expected, but not with Engels, but with Karl von Clausewitz. Marx and Engels wrote an enormous amount about war. They had a sort of division of labor between them, in a sense, where Marx would, for example, write extensively about economic aspects and so on, particularly when we look at, for example, the US Civil War. But Engels, as we'll go on to see, had an extraordinary knowledge of warfare, of historical examples of, and wrote extensively on a wide range of different aspects of war. But to start with Karl von Clausewitz, and I thought I'd throw this in because while I was preparing for this session, I dug out my own copy of On War by von Clausewitz. Clausewitz entered the Prussian army at the tender age of 12, where he was given the rank of corporal, and finally retired as a major general. He served in the Napoleonic Wars, but took exception to the peace that was made with Napoleon, and out of frustration, resigned his commission and joined the Russian army and fought against Napoleon from 1812 to 1813. On War was not published in his lifetime. His wife subsequently published it from materials which were not fully worked out. Much of it was well written, but there were bits and pieces that were really in note form. So his wife should take a certain amount of credit for being his literary executor. The reason why I've decided to mention von Clausewitz is because Friedrich Engels wrote very approvingly of him, and more importantly, drew on his analysis and was able to see that actually von Clausewitz had a dialectical approach to war. I'm going to just, this isn't the place to talk about von Clausewitz in any great depth, but of course everybody is familiar with von Clausewitz's almost aphoristic statement: the war is a mere continuation of policy by other means. And what I mean by a dialectical analysis of war is, for example, if you're thinking about attack, one can't just think of an attack without also taking into account defense and the relationship between the two. And of course, having been in the Russian army against Napoleon, this was given a powerful impetus, because the typical kind of caricature of Napoleon's advance into Russia was of him overstretching his supply lines and effectively being beaten by the Russian winter rather than by the Russian army. This isn't entirely true. Whatever weaknesses the Russian army had, what it had was an extraordinarily good light cavalry, which was able to skirmish, cut off French supply lines, and continually harass the enemy. And so by drawing Russia in, a conscious policy of using retreat as a basis for then attack is part of that dialectic of war. And it was precisely this dialectical approach to the question of war. And von Clausewitz does it in a number of interesting places. I haven't finished my study of von Clausewitz, so I won't dwell any more on that. I just thought it was a fascinating insight into why Friedrich Engels saw von Clausewitz as such an important theorist of war. So when we're thinking about future conflicts, let's start with the classics. Okay, so here's Friedrich Engels. You've all seen before. His popular nickname among his friends, and in an affectionate and respectful way, was the General. It was known that he had extensive military knowledge. He did his national service, which was 1 year as a bombardier in the so a corporal, effectively, in the Prussian artillery. And on the strength of that, developed his interest in military matters. He went then to work he'd become a bit of a kind of disappointment to his parents, and they shoved him off to go and work in Ehrman and Engels in Manchester in the hope that it would kind of straighten him out. His parents were quite pious, religious people, and all of a sudden they find that their son has gone wayward and become an atheist and a communist. A situation not unfamiliar to maybe some in the audience. So working for Ehrman and Engels in Manchester for a while, he then subsequently met Karl Marx for the second time in 1844. And of course, the outcome of that was, as we know, things like the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, the Paris manuscripts. He had met Marx before that, but they hadn't really got on because Marx thought he was one of the young Hegelians that he'd been so critical of. But on the strength of his work, both with Marx, but also working in Manchester, he of course published The Condition of the Working Class in England, and later, of course, with Marx, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And of course, that agitational pamphlet was written for the revolutions of 1848, and of course they wrote extensively about the events of 1848, most famously class struggles in France, where they focused upon the French experience of 1848. But Engels also wrote his own work on the events of 1848, of revolution and counter-revolution in Germany, which looked at, in particular, Prussia and Austria as potential kind of leading countries among the German people. In 1849, in the south of Germany, he served as aide-de-camp for August Willich, a man who disagreed violently with Marx because he regarded Marx as too right-wing, which is a kind of fascinating notion. August Willich, who himself was an intriguing character who challenged Marx to a duel, which Marx mercifully didn't take up. And August Willich fought valiantly against Prussia in the south of Germany, along with Friedrich Engels as his aide-de-camp. Engels was one of the last people to leave when Willich's volunteer battalion was beaten. It was a battalion of Freikorps. We tend to think of the Freikorps as being the antecedents of fascism that killed Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. But actually, there was a whole history of Freikorps, of volunteer battalions serving in the German army at various times. And Willich had taken a revolutionary stance, and Engels with him. He was one of the last people to leave the field, and his family and Marx feared for his life, but Engels managed to escape, having served with great courage in the revolutions of 1848-49, and escaped into Switzerland. Now, you'd think that was kind of life enough for a while, and you could kind of sit back and rest on your laurels. But having then returned to England to take up the day job, as it were, Ehrman and Engels, he then sat down to write The Peasant War in Germany, which I'll come on to in a moment. Other writings are actually too numerous to list, and my summer project might be to do some of this. But of course, both he and Marx wrote extensively on the Crimean War, and extensively on the American Civil War, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment, and a fascinating set of notes on the Franco-Prussian War. We tend to think of the writings of Marx and Engels on the Franco-Prussian War as being, for example, the Civil War in France, where Marx writes about the Paris Commune. And of course, that's an extremely important document. But bizarrely, maybe, Engels wrote a whole series of articles throughout the entire period, just simply called Notes on the War, for the Pall Mall Gazette, a nice bourgeois newspaper. There's all sorts of reasons for it. I suspect some of it was quite pragmatic. Engels was in the habit of writing extensively for journalism, and sometimes the work would be attributed to Marx so that Marx would get the money. It was a way in which Engels helped to support Marx. Engels also wrote articles which are fascinating. There's a really good little history of the rifle by Frederick Engels, which he wrote for the New American Encyclopedia. And he also wrote another article on the history of cavalry. There may well be others, but those are the two that I've read. And the first thing that strikes you is the sheer attention to detail. In his notes on the Franco-Prussian War, the whole progress of the war is followed for the Pall Mall Gazette. And it includes, and absolutely completely up to date to the time. It must have been like following it on Fox News, God help us, or something completely up to date, completely in touch with the details of what was going on in France and Germany at the time, and published in, of all places, the Pall Mall Gazette. He also wrote, as part of that, essays on the nature of the organization of the Prussian military, which was important, as we'll go on to see. But going back a moment, I want to draw attention to this excellent little pamphlet. For those of you who are, like me, occasionally driven to distraction by the sight of Lucy Worsley talking about the Tudors or some dreadful kind of mess that's passed off as history, the Peasant War in Germany is a superb little work which is able to, by reading the Peasant War in Germany, you're able to understand the Reformation not merely as a matter about religion, but the extent to which the debates between Thomas Müntzer and Martin Luther were, in a sense, both an expression of class struggle that was taking place at the time. Like me, having studied sociology, if you've read that turgid piece of work by Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, reading the Peasant War in Germany is a necessary corrective, in my opinion. So what Frederick Engels does, having just returned effectively from fighting on the front line in the wars in Germany, writes about the parallels between the Peasant War in Germany between 1524 and 1525. Well, what parallels could there be? After all, we're looking at something quite different here. And I wanted to use this also to try and draw a distinction between war in the feudal period, whether we call this the feudal period, a late feudal period, I suppose, and a war in a capitalist epoch. The German Peasant War, Engels goes on to write, and the other aspect of this is very important. Throughout Engels' writing on warfare, he's at pains to show how the conflicts between different classes and different sections of different classes, again, this grotesque caricature that one sees from Weberian sociologists is that somehow Marx and Engels only thought there were two classes and that was that, and it was just about economics, blah, blah. But hang on a minute. Here's Engels drawing a parallel between the peasant war in Germany, the German peasant war, and the different class forces at play in that war at that time. So he contrasts, for example, what he calls the big princes of Germany of the day and the noblemen. And he talks about, for example, noblemen that have effectively become kind of ruined over time. Knights who, for example, at one time would have had an important position within the context of German feudal society. And these knights in a kind of sorry economic state, having lost their place in the world, look towards the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. And it is that Martin Luther's theses speaks to, and the idea of the wish to expropriate the wealth of the church speaks very highly to a dispossessed class within German society. And what he goes on further to do is to talk about the way in which these different strata of German society enter into alliances with one another. And of course, the very reason why he's chosen that is because, having come from Germany in 1849, 1850, and having seen the way in which different classes are playing off against one another, against the possibility of a potential revolutionary component in the proletariat, particularly when one contrasts it with what happened in France and the deposition of Louis Philippe and the declaration of the Second Republic. So here's a thing. Why is feudal war different, in a sense, to capitalist war? Well, if you think about it, I mean, you've got a situation where in a feudal society, a large number of the population is unfree labor. Serfs, generally speaking, didn't bear arms. So it's a whole stratum of knights, as it were, or there may well have been sergeants and low-ranking soldiers kept as a standing army by noblemen to advance their particular claims, because wealth being measured largely in land. So you have a situation where the nature of war is a war of conquest and of the acquisition of land, but that's a very different position to the wars that we see, well, arguably from the English Civil War, but in particular after the Great French Revolution of 1789. So modern war is different. Napoleon's army was an army effectively of citizen soldiers. And of course, the other aspect, which I think is important in looking at Engels' consideration of war, is the way in which he carefully relates it to the production relations. And by the time we get to the American Civil War, what we'll start to see is it's the industrial strength, the industrial power of the Union supporting the Union Army that is decisive in its victory over the Confederacy. So highly recommend this fantastic little essay, The Peasant War in Germany by Friedrich Engels. I don't like to put a lot of text on slides, but this I just simply couldn't resist. It's a fantastic statement written in, so as we know, Karl Marx wrote Class Struggles in France. But in Revolution and Counter-Revolution by Friedrich Engels, he has this to say about insurrection. And I think it's fascinating because, of course, it's this, again, this dialectical relationship between the armies of the state and the potential insurrectionary military power of the working classes. So I'll read it out because it's a dense pile of text. Firstly, never play with insurrection unless you are fully prepared to face the consequences of your play. Insurrection is a calculus with very indefinite magnitudes, the value of which may change every day. And here the emphasis is added by me, by the way. The forces opposed to you have all the advantages of organization, discipline, and habitual authority. Unless you bring strong odds against them, you are defeated and ruined. Secondly, the insurrectionary career, once entered upon, act with the greatest determination and on the offensive. The defensive is the death of every armed rising. It is lost before it measures itself with its enemies. Surprise your antagonists while their forces are scattering. Prepare new successes, however small, but daily. Keep up the moral ascendant which the first successful rising is given to you. Rally thus those vacillating elements to your side, which always follow the strongest impulse and always look out for the safer side. Force your enemies to a retreat before they can collect their strength against you. In the words of Danton, the greatest master of revolutionary policy yet known, de l'audace et encore de l'audace. So audacity, audacity, and again, audacity. The reason why I mentioned it, of course, is Engels was painfully aware that revolutionaries stuck behind a barricade with outdated weapons have got no chance. In the Great French Revolution, it may have been possible to command the streets for a while behind barricades, but by the time you've got rifled cannon, rifles, indeed, your chances of success are minimal without that audacity. So, as we know, the US Civil War was something that occupied Marx and Engels extensively, and they wrote on it both politically and militarily. In a sense, there was a kind of division of labor between them. Engels wrote extensively on the economics of the USA, and again, this was published widely. They both, well, Engels in particular, but they both wrote for the New York Daily Tribune, and they were inclined to see this as a revolutionary war. So although it's not a socialist revolution, it's not a socialist revolutionary war, it is in fact the logical completion of the revolution of 1776, by which the USA won its independence. And I know that Marx, as on behalf of the International Working Men's Association, wrote to Abraham Lincoln congratulating him on his victory, but history doesn't really record what Abraham Lincoln thought of that. However, the important thing here is that this was a revolutionary war. The idea that the freeing of the slaves was an absolutely central, pivotal moment in the 19th century. And of course, it also illustrates some of the aspects around war and technology. You could write extensively about that alone. You could probably get a PhD out of that on its own. But I'm just going to name just one thing, and it's the mini ball rifle. That's the Minet ball rifle, strictly speaking. So muskets at the time were smoothbore, fired literally a ball, and were quick to load, but monstrously inaccurate. They were after about accuracy was about 500 feet. So hence you had to fight in great banks of soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, in order to concentrate fire. The mini ball rifle, developed and used during the Crimean War, was a self-expanding bullet, which is a strange thing in itself. So these are still musket-loaded rifles, but the barrels, instead of being smooth, are rifled. There's a groove that runs the whole length of the barrel, several grooves that run the whole length of the barrel, which allows the projectile to spin and makes it much more accurate at a far greater distance. The mini ball rifle was still loaded from the muzzle, but whereas in the past, rifles you had to have a fairly tight fit in order to take the rifling, otherwise they just didn't spin. And the way in which you achieved that before the mini ball rifles, you had to just ram it down as hard as you could, and it therefore took much longer time to load than ordinary muskets. But what Minet discovered was that if you, for example, have a bullet-shaped, what we would now think of as a bullet-shaped projectile, with a little cup in the bottom, as the charge goes off, it causes the softer metal of the projectile to expand, thereby taking up the rifling and making it deadly accurate. Now, Pickett's charge, for example, during the US Civil War, was not a particularly great distance that the Confederate infantry had to cover, but under normal circumstances, faced against smoothbore muskets, they could have done it, and they could have got to the Union side to inflict some damage when they got there. Because all the Union side were using mass-produced mini-bore rifles, Pickett's charge got no further than 3/4 of the way before the entire Confederate onslaught was decimated, indeed annihilated. So, although I'm talking about Engels as a kind of theorist of war, he wasn't writing about war in the way that von Clausewitz wrote as war, as a kind of general treatise on the nature of war. He wrote extensively on particular situations rather than trying to write a kind of generalized history of war. So, to give you one example, in the articles that he wrote for the Pall Mall Gazette, at one point he said, well, we need to think about on the Franco-Prussian War, when Engels was writing about the Franco-Prussian War for the Pall Mall Gazette, he says, well, we don't need to think about we only really need to concentrate on the infantry, because it's the infantry that's really decisive. We don't need to bother ourselves with fancy bits of technology. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, the French had a kind of prototype machine gun, which was quite an awe-inspiring proposition. If anyone's seen cowboy films with Gatling guns, it was a bit like that. It was mounted on a carriage and turned with a crank, but it could fire quite a lot of rounds. And so Engels here is saying, well, we need to concentrate on the infantry. As we'll see with other writings, Engels is enormously flexible and develops his ideas over time, and is writing about specific circumstances rather than trying to have a general thesis, a general theory of war as such. So, as we know, both Marx and Engels wrote extensively on the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, and Trotsky reviewed Engels' writing on the Franco-Prussian War, and particularly makes comment about this comment made by Engels, that we need to think about the infantry rather than fancy machine guns being used by the French. But of course, things had changed by then, and of course Trotsky himself was no mean theorist of military tactics, and wrote extensively on military matters. He had been, of course, a correspondent during the Balkan Wars, and of course played a crucial role as the founder indeed, and leader of the Red Army during the Russian Revolution. But here in this, in 1924, Trotsky is reviewing Engels' notes on the Franco-Prussian War. And one of the things he points out, of course, is that Engels, in dismissing the importance of things like the machine gun, of course, has been completely transformed. So, in a sense, you can make your own mind up as which constitutes the first modern war. But here in the Franco-Prussian War, you have the beginnings of machine guns, you have the beginnings of trench warfare, you have the bombardment of Paris by guns made by Krupp, subsequently to be repeated in the First World War. And of course, ultimately, it leads to the Commune and what followed. The review by Trotsky is interesting as well, because he quite clearly has followed Engels' development as a military tactician and theorist very carefully, and shows a full appreciation of Engels' writing on the Franco-Prussian War. And so, of course, as we know, if we go back to that lengthy quote that I gave about what insurrectionists should do, another thing that both Marx and Engels had written about was that whatever else happens, the communards, the workers of Paris should not stage an insurrection. They have a duty, as it were, to not do something which you can say in advance is going to lead to a defeat, which is going to set the workers' movement back 20 to 50 years. And on that, they were absolutely right. But coming back to this question of audacity, once the commune had been declared, once they'd seized power, then it's audacity, audacity, and again, audacity. March on Versailles. Don't just put reverential troops outside the Bank of France, seize the bullion therein and use it to propagate the war. So, as we know, the commune has shown the importance of having a citizen army rather than a standing army. The communards were largely made up of volunteers for the Garde Mobile and others who volunteered as part of an insurrectionary force and a democratic force, just as in other parts and other times, democracy has emerged in a military context. One of the things that's fascinating about Engels' essay on the history of cavalry is that he sees its ultimate expression really in that period, for example, from the English Revolution onwards, when instead of in the feudal period, big heavy horses that have to carry knights with armor, instead you have relatively fast horses that carry a cavalryman with saber in hand, and indeed sometimes pistol too, and indeed mounted infantry carrying a short rifle known as a dragon, which is why so many cavalry regiments are called dragoons. So we have direct democracy alongside the idea of no standing army. In the Franco-Prussian War, which of course was launched by Louis Napoleon in an effort to stop German unification, we see also the political attitude of Marx and Engels. There's not a hint of German nationalism in them. They are wholly opposed to Louis Napoleon, and therefore wholly opposed to what he's trying to do in terms of a surprise attack upon Prussia in an effort to stop Prussian unification. The French attack on Prussia was a surprise attack because of the very nature of the way in which the Prussian army was organized. You had basically a huge army, but a large part of that was made up of the Landwehr, so reservists. It would be as if, for example, most of the population did some national service of, say, a year, and then was in the Landwehr and could be called up at any moment in time of war. And what Louis Napoleon was counting on was the idea that it would take Prussia so long to mobilize that he would have secured a rapid victory. And to that extent, soldiers were even dispatched to Germany without any kind of maps, for example, of France, so that when they were resolutely beaten, and the picture here is a fantastic picture of Otto von Bismarck talking to Louis Napoleon after he'd been captured at Sedan, which was, of course, described as in the novel Le Débarque. So I've mentioned a bit about insurrection. I've mentioned about a number of different wars, but what about the socialist attitude towards wars of independence? The picture here is of Giuseppe Garibaldi, of course. And Marx and Engels wrote approvingly of Garibaldi and Garibaldi's attempt to unify Italy, and very much against the interventions of Louis Napoleon. Garibaldi, of course, was a supporter of the First International. And although had considerable differences with Marx, but Garibaldi had intervened both in South America and then for Italian unification, and interestingly addressed meetings up and down the United Kingdom. I was pleasantly surprised to learn that Garibaldi once addressed packed meetings of workers in South Shields. So I need to track that down as to where exactly that was. So what's the relationship then between wars of independence? They don't use the term national liberation, but wars of independence and here of national unification with regard to Marx and Engels. The idea that somehow one always supports a nationalist struggle or a nationalist movement is not something that you find in Marx. You find it, which is in a way which is takes it into full account the conditions of the time and the class forces that are arrayed against one another. So, for example, the tendency was really to oppose Russia as a reactionary gendarme of Europe. So supporting, for example, Polish independence because recognizing that Russia is an impediment to the development of Poland, recognizing that Garibaldi's unification of Italy takes it away from the interference, for example, of the Papal States and the interference of France and so on. So it's so it has a national character to it, but undoubtedly it's about achieving the unification of Italy in order that Italy can more fully develop and become a more fully developed capitalist country as part of a development towards socialism. Rather than being a fragmented series of feudal states, rather like Germany too. But for example, Marx wrote rather scathingly about, or Engels too wrote rather scathingly about about demands for Slav independence elsewhere, apart from Poland, on the grounds that this could stand in the way of the development of a unified working class, and would always rather see a united working class, and rather than the consequences that can follow on from unnecessary and largely pointless insurrections, which are rooted in a nationalist perspective. Engels as well, by the way, understood fully the dangers of and is regarded as having foreseen, in a sense, that the slaughter that would follow from a war in Germany against the rest of Europe, or so foresaw what would happen in World War I in terms of the absolute destruction of the workers' movement that could lead to. So how does this lead us all on to the present? I've just got two pictures there just to consider. The rifle that you see is the standard British Army issue SA-80 rifle. That little magazine, the black thing behind the handle, the pistol grip, that magazine holds 30 rounds of 5.75 caliber. Small bullets. Why small bullets? Because you've got small bullets, you can carry more of them. And after all, you don't necessarily need to kill someone. If you badly wound them, then you're going to need at least 2 other people to get him off the battlefield. And these things are calculated when it comes to the design of weapons. That rifle is lethal at 300 meters, and you can't see it because it's on the other side of the rifle. With a flick of a switch, it turns into a submachine gun, and you can empty that magazine in seconds. And it loads itself, reloads itself on the basis of a mechanical action of the gas that's expelled during the firing of the weapon, where a needle, an extension effectively of the Prussian needle gun of the 19th century. Most of these developments were in Prussia. And those gases are then used to have a piston effect, which reloads the next weapon. Still lethal at 300 meters, and there's a light support weapon which is almost exactly the same, which is lethal at 600 meters. The Apache helicopter there has a different type of gun. It has a chain gun, and that doesn't bother with reloading with gases. It's electronically reloaded and can fire 300 rounds a minute, 30 caliber rounds that will go through brick, and it has a sight which can effectively detect the heat profile of people inside buildings. So you can't just hide in a building and escape the Apache helicopter. I mention that purely because if we now then think of the war that's taking place in Ukraine, what we're seeing is something which is really quite extraordinary. We're seeing a combination of high-tech elements, of the use of drones, for example, which can rain down death without even risking the life of a pilot. And at the same time, you're seeing World War II type destruction, of carpet destruction of whole cities. And at the same time, the tank has become obsolete because a rifle, an infantryman with a shoulder-held anti-tank weapon can destroy that tank in a moment. And the importance of air power. So it's important when we then start to think about the demand for a popular militia is something I would definitely support. But nevertheless, let's think about the powers that are arrayed against us, if ever there was anybody we've got in a position to think about insurrection ever again. Thank you, comrades.
Brilliant, comrade. Thank you very, very much. That was a really thought-provoking and wide-ranging introduction. Comrades, anybody's got any questions or would like to come in, make a comment, please click raise hand. I'm going to start off a bit, as always. Did Marx and Engels talk much or discuss much the different reasons for war? Because there will be different areas where, you know, for, as you say, not just national liberation, these different kind of wars, but also sort of intercapitalist wars, why they are happening, etc. And linked to that, you know, the Clausewitz quote is very interesting. War is the continuation of other peaceful politics by other peaceful means. Do they wouldn't describe themselves as pacifists, would they? Or and same for socialists. I mean, it's if peace is the same as war, just used, you know, with other means, how did that find reflection in their dialectical approach to war, etc.?
Absolutely, they thought about the various causes of war. I mean, the US Civil War is fascinating from that point of view. The economic interests of the South, rooted in slavery. I mean, the majority of US presidents up until Lincoln had been slave owners, in fact. And of course, and seeing how that interacted on a worldwide scale was fascinating as well. So the British government wanted very much to intervene on the side of the Confederacy, not least of which because obviously there was huge investment in terms of the British textile industry, and there was a moment where Britain, in classical perfidious manner, basically sold weapons to both sides, built warships for the Confederacy, but was in fact prevented from intervening directly on the side of the Confederacy in no small part because of massive working class opposition to the war, massive opposition to intervention on behalf of the Confederacy, in large part because of British workers' opposition to slavery. But when, for example, we're looking at the Franco-Prussian War and Louis Napoleon's wish to see the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71 followed on the back, as it were, of the war between Prussia and Austria in 1866. In a sense, that was a war which decided which large power within Germany was going to be the dominant one. And of course, it came out very much as Prussia would be the dominant one. and once that war had been decided, once Prussia had emerged as dominant over Austria, Louis Napoleon's concern was that an industrializing Prussia, unifying with the other smaller states, would be a very difficult adversary to beat, whether economically or militarily. And knowing that it would take, or he thought at least, that it would take a long time for the Prussian military to fully mobilize, decided to attack immediately, wholly unprepared and wholly failing to understand just how well developed the Landwehr was, and just how quickly Bismarck would get his troops into. And the other thing, of course, that's changed is not just the technology, but the nature of warfare as politics, as a way of ensuring accumulation, not on the basis of land, not on the basis of physical conquest, but on the basis of military hegemony, which is concerned with the extraction of a surplus from subordinate parts of the world by other means. So you can have a situation where countries, for example, whether they're in Africa or India or wherever else, can be indebted to Western banks, or can be indebted through whether it's the pricing of oil in dollars or whatever else. And of course, then that's backed up militarily. It isn't necessary anymore to just go and invade. In fact, that's expensive. So there's no need to have colonies as such. You can do it through the banking system, but you still have that massive military backup in case anyone decides to step out of line and decide to use some other currency apart from dollars, for example. So that's the other important way in which warfare has changed from feudal warfare in earlier periods.
But the
they were certainly not pacifists, by the way. Definitely not. But it was a question of, it's the proletariat. The workers are only one country, and it's the international proletariat.
Well, that's an interesting one. In the German Revolution and in other wars, the rising working class was fighting alongside the rising bourgeoisie, if you like. So how did this describe this? Did you turn your weapons occasionally in the same direction, and after the war you turn it against your immediate enemy? Was there any kind of understanding, as Lenin developed it some more, turn the imperialist war into a class war, that afterwards it's us, that kind of idea?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because of course I've focused on Marx and Engels on war, and at the time they were writing, I mean, Engels understood that what could be on the cards was what actually happened in World War I. But it was Engels really Lenin rather that took that necessary step further and say, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. Your duty is to fight your own ruling class, as it were. The extent to which Marx and Engels were prepared to support, say, a bourgeois revolution is seen in the American Civil War. I mean, there's no illusions that this was a socialist. It is interesting that socialists should take part, like Willich. Willich went off and fought a very distinguished war on the side of the Union Army after he had to get the hell out of Germany. He ended up emigrating to the USA and fighting for the Union. So that whole fascinating discussion around Thomas Müntzer and the 1848 war in Germany was about exactly the way in which there would be alliances between different classes and different sections of different classes. But of course, in a sense, that's been simplified. I mean, Germany, of course, bears no relation. No part of the capitalist world is in a similar kind of position, as far as I can see, where you're talking about an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. What peasantry? An alliance between the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie. What petty bourgeoisie? Yes, there are shopkeepers or whatever else, but for the most part, they're virtually proletarians anyway. And the proletariat is now, of course, the majority of the world's population. So, in a sense, the class antagonisms have been simplified.
Somebody asked in the chat, and I'm sure that's would have come up anyway. It's the sort of referring back to today, for example, when you look at a situation like Ukraine. Did they ever? I mean, you outlined very well that they studied every single situation. There isn't a template you take, and that's what you do in a war of independence. And that's what you do then. But it's you study the class forces, etc. A situation like with Ukraine, a bigger bad country against a smaller bad country. Do we have to take sides in issues, in situations like that? Did that come much up?
I mean, speaking personally, no. I mean, of course, there may be people who will disagree. I mean, some on the left have taken this idea that they'll adopt the right of nations to self-determination put forward by Lenin and say, well, this is an argument somehow for defending Ukrainian independence. But hang on, what kind of Ukraine would it be? We're not talking about the liberation of India, for example, from the British Empire. Britain did an enormous amount to impede the development of Indian industry across the board, and was, of course, directly responsible for the famines that killed millions. So the liberation of India from the British Empire would undoubtedly have been a very positive thing. By contrast, what kind of government does Zelensky represent? Are we forced to choose between Ukrainian oligarchs as somehow less nasty than Russian oligarchs? The only stance I think we should take is to oppose the ruling class everywhere. I would support Ukrainians overthrowing Zelensky, and I would support Russians overthrowing Putin in favor of a united world. And I think now we're past that stage where we're talking about the progressive liberation of one small state from domination. There may well be instances where that's still the case, particularly where, for example, there's the suppression of a language or the suppression of a whole culture, and we would support those people who are being oppressed. But in terms of trying to, no, I can't. So no war but the class war, I think, is probably our best slogan.
Yeah, indeed. Just one last issue then, and you mentioned it a couple of times, the citizen army. It sounds quite, for us on the left, it sounds, on the Marxist left, it sounds quite a normal thing to put forward. It's very controversial, even on the socialist left, that we shouldn't have we should all get involved, we should learn weaponry. I have colleagues who from East Germany, and they know how to take a rifle apart and put it together, and a machine gun and stuff, which is quite useful. But a lot of people, let's say, influenced by the Corbyn years and that movement, the peace and justice project, for example, that is, they would run a mile with that idea that the people should be prepared to fight, and not, everybody should get involved in it. How do they discuss that issue of people taking up arms? And say the U.S. Constitution, you have a mass shooting in America, and if you're of the left, you'll demand, that's almost a normal thing, people shouldn't have weapons, etc. When communists have a job explaining, actually, people should have weapons. It depends, obviously, how regulated, etc. How much did they write about that kind of issue?
Well, the US Constitution's right to bear arms was in the context of a regulated militia, and as a bastion against tyranny, against the tyranny of either British rule or of any tyrant that might subsequently arise. And from that point of view, I would fully agree with the idea of a citizen army. And it's not so very unusual. I mean, Switzerland has every adult male in Switzerland has a uniform and a rifle sitting at home. But of course, that doesn't make it a socialist militia, but every single person knows how to hold a weapon. Of course, in the context of the Soviet Union, everybody had to do the national service. So and that's still the case, I understand, in Russia. So you've got people being called up to do national service, and you learn to use weapons. In the context of the commune, of course, the idea again was that a proper workers' militia is a guarantee against some sort of tyranny. And we now have the situation. I mean, what the British Army is now about 75,000. So it's only professional soldiers. And interestingly, of course, almost all recruited from the poorest sections of the working class. After all, there's plenty of other jobs out there that don't require you to sign up for 3 years at a minimum. So I would very much be in favour of a citizen army, but let's not pretend that we can go running about in the woods and we can represent some kind of counterforce, as it were, against the kinds of weapons you got. Where are you going to get them? So just little things like that. And so what we're absolutely going to be dependent upon is at least part of the armed forces coming over to a revolutionary side. It's not too difficult to imagine. I was fascinated by the meeting on China that we went to, and I just couldn't help but think about, if there is war with China, when the cheap goods that we can no longer have because of America's blockade of China starts to exert its impact, is that going to be a change in the way we see things? I can't see either, though, that the ruling class is necessarily going to want to have a large-scale war and arm lots of people for the very reasons, in a sense, we're already outlining. The Second World War, in a way, was quite remarkable in being a citizen army, but I can't see the ruling class being happy with that prospect again. The idea of millions of working class people being armed to the teeth.
Sorry, one last question. I've got a couple of people with their hands up now because it's come up in the chat. Why are socialists not pacifists? Why do we not call for peace? What's the problem with peace?
Nothing. And I'm very much in favour of peace. And that was the other thing about Marx and Engels as well, is that they were very much in favour of peace, because wars that were springing up, for example, for Czech independence or some such, were in a sense a distraction from the class struggle. I'm very much in favour of peace because I don't like people getting killed, and because when it comes down to it, it's not going to be an easy war that we could ever win. But at the same time, we have to recognise that the ruling class isn't going to give up power quietly. As I say, one of my earliest political experiences was the murder of Salvador Allende. That tells you what the parliamentary road to socialism leads. And so we have to brace ourselves for the fact that as soon as a growing workers' movement becomes effective, it's going to face violence, and violence on an industrial scale if needs be.
And of course, when you consider the Clausewitz quote, he does describe that peace is just what the capitalists do different, it's a different side, just the other side of the coin of war. They're continuing their exploitation of the world. They're continuing their pressure with diplomatic means against other countries, etc. Almost like, you starving people, people die every day because of what the class war, class society produces. Not necessarily with weapons, but through, there's no food, there's no, the way capitalism has organized the globe. So peace is not nice. It's not, it's not much better for vast majority of the population than war. It's the same thing. I'm going to bring in a couple of people now. I think Matthew had his hand up first. There he is.
Hi, Comrade. No, it's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks, Ian. I think there's a few. Obviously, there's lots of points out of this one. Yeah. And obviously, you say, citizen army in the Second World War is one of my dad's experiences. Of course, was playing with a submachine gun in the bottom of my grandfather's wardrobe. So, an abiding thing for him. The thing, I think that apart from lots of bits of it, for things like the American Civil War was hugely influential. Was the first industrial war, had a massive impact. But actually to construct the US itself, plus of course the effect of that mass casualty rate. I mean, the casualty rate in the American Civil War was enormous, and that had a profound psychological effect for decades, and probably still lasting to this day. Through number of conflicts, the other thing, of course, the other notable thing, of course, is the savagery of the US ruling class. It's always been one of the most savage ruling classes ever. I mean, confronted with any organization of workers or whatever, its first resort has been to lethal violence. Nearly, it's an incredible outfit. But I think the other thing that really also is the effect of imperialism that they have constructed through. I mean, particularly I think after the experience of the Paris Commune, the ruling class conceded to a degree to the working class in its own countries at the expense of the rest of the world, and therefore constructed this system of imperialism, where it was able to co-opt to a large degree the working class in these countries into its military forces and in fact to defend for its own use over a period of in excess of a century, and that has a really serious effect. We can see it now. I mean, obviously, even as a you can see this mass wave of people moving towards Europe or the US, because obviously in an imperialist country, even as an oppressed minority, you're many times better off than sitting in an imperialized country, let alone one that's been demolished. But you've also it's entered to be able to pull those people into war, and you can see the effect of that in the First World War, where in fact, of course, despite the fact that the Second International passed all these motions clearly, and people understood. I mean, Engels understood that this war was coming, and they discussed it over decades and said, yeah, it's coming. We need to fight against it. But so when it actually arrived, of course, the thing fell apart. And now what we have, of course, is a system of perpetual war. I mean, the British haven't actually had a peaceful year since 1945, apart from, I think somebody said 1968. So they've actually been perpetually at war all the time. It's an incredible thing, but they've actually managed to incorporate that into the running of the state. I mean, despite the fact, obviously, that war actually acts as a major issue in terms of accelerating the class struggle and so on, and a really serious impact. They've managed to incorporate, this perpetual relatively, wars of various types. I mean, in some cases, quite large wars, like the Vietnam War, but continuous all the time. What the difference, what you're seeing with the Ukraine war, of course, is that they haven't prepared an industrial base to cope with what they have to do with that war. So in fact, they're running out of the necessary material to fight the damn thing, which is why it's going to get interesting. Because I mean, clearly they just don't manufacture enough. I mean, artillery ammunition for a start. I mean, basic stuff like that. Which is why Joe Biden said, "Oh, we'll start dropping cluster bombs," because we're actually running out of everything else. And it's that system. And as you say, in terms of like the British are able to then co-opt, I mean, communities, over generations going into the army or other branches of the military, despite the fact, of course, they treat veterans so poorly. I mean, people who actually do this work and of course get damaged by it are then fired out onto the street and to the prisons. It's incredible, and you would have thought there'd be a greater political kickback on that basis. The fact that there's such a huge impact on a very large number of people. And I think that the other thing I was going to say is in terms of what we're sitting on now, of course, is that the impact into the class struggle of the current conflicts, and the fact that the US is in such a poor position, it's actually in such a position of decline. It's going to it actually intensifies the situation. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. We've got a few people now with a hand up. Ian, is it okay if I take one more before you come back?
Absolutely. I agree almost with everything Matthew said anyway.
All right, fair enough. Okay, Minnie first.
Thank you, and thanks to Ian for that talk. I didn't know Engels knew that much about war, and Garibaldi was into the First International. Yeah, don't do anything unless you can. So don't do anything unless you can, you can do it, basically. But do something every day towards that. We need to build forces. We have such forces trained against us, including surveillance, weapons, you name it. Yeah, I'd like to ask Ian what Marx and Engels have to say about capitalism capitalist competition leading to war. And just I've got some other things to say. Victor said in the chat about the ruling class being organized to exploit us, being really organized. But when you look at them and you look at what they're doing to the planet, are they so organized? They're not looking ahead. Obviously, any socialist future that we plan needs to look ahead and take everyone's future into account and keep renewing that. So what they're doing is I read something that the US military causes enough climate damage as 100 small countries give out in emissions. And it's interesting what you said about, about the planning and short-sightedness and the methane that was released when, was it the US who bombed that pipeline? A lot of their base is going to disappear anyway because of climate change. Yeah, and the fact that we're closer to nuclear war and they're basically leading us to the brink. So where's their capitalism going to be then? They haven't got their spaceship yet to leave and another planet to live on yet, have they? And they can't even go down to the Titanic anymore. And maybe see some jewels shining in the mud. I thought that talk on China was very interesting last night, about US hegemony, the colonial imperialism of going into Ukraine. Obviously they're going into lots of countries, like they went into Iraq, Afghanistan, places like that. They went in for resources, raw materials for production and distribution, fossil fuels, things to make the wars are going to be fought over things to make microchips with, we know that. And you said about finance capital, about deals being done behind doors. I read something today about Turkey. Biden apparently has done a deal behind closed doors with Turkey. That's why Turkey's come back on side with, is it allowing other countries into NATO giving that vote? Because Biden has assured, is it Erdogan, that he's going to get billions from the IMF, and that's all been done behind closed doors, and that's finance capital. I think Peter was talking about that in the chat. And Turkey's one of those countries that spends so much on servicing its debt already. Really weird. Yeah, so, and the contracts that are already being set up in Ukraine, the American corporations, so destroy and rebuild. And just one last thing I wanted to say was that who has the weapons? Who has weapons? And they don't know how to use guns, because in Liverpool, we've had people shot recently because OCGs, organised crime gangs, are shooting. They're spraying. One guy sprayed a machine gun into to try and get a rival, and he injured 4 people and murdered an innocent woman. And we had an innocent little girl murdered as well. So the people who are getting the weapons are the people who are mimicking, mirroring capitalism and their ruthless methods. It's like an exploitative chain of drug wars and gangs modeled on that system, and it's shocking. Thanks.
Thank you, comrade. Ian, do you want to come in now?
Just tiny little things. For example, I've stressed about the technology of war and about what we're up against. And the Socialist Party of Great Britain, for example, use that as an argument, saying, well, look, we just have to wait. We've got widespread agreement that we need socialism. The problem with that, of course, is that in the meantime, what do? And these things are going on anyway. And I want to come back to the kind of questions of the dialectics of war, this interpenetration of accident and necessity. And just to take one example, and it was something that was raised by Matthew as well, so it's a useful kind of example. Let's take Vietnam. So what had formerly been French Indochina was France's colonies were taken off them by the Japanese. And at the end of World War II, Lord Mountbatten of Burma, as he was, Supreme Commander Southeast Asia, rearmed the Japanese army to make sure the French got their colonies back. What then, of course, happened is that France couldn't hold it and were beaten in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And the United States then gets sucked into trying to prevent the possibility of Soviet dominance in Southeast Asia, Vietnam in particular. So coming back to the point about that was made by a previous speaker about Caroline, wasn't it? About planning. Yes, there is planning, but it doesn't always work. And the exigencies and that long quote I had about the way in which things change very suddenly and very quickly is very important. And then this whole question about imperialism is an interesting one, particularly in the context of the meeting we had about China. It seems that in many respects, China is an imperialist country. It exports capital. It clearly extracts a surplus from other countries in the way that the United States does, albeit on a much, much smaller scale. Does that mean we have to support the small capitalist, the small imperialist against the big imperialist? No. We're opposed to imperialism in all its forms, just as we were opposed to the Vietnam War. We're not opposed to we weren't opposed to the Vietnam War because it was a war, but because it was slaughtering millions of people. Something like 3 million people died in the context of what had been French Indochina. But just that, really.
Thank you, comrade. Pamela, please.
Thanks very much. So some questions. Jeff Barr put in a question saying, what was this Jewish Nazi Ukrainian march into Russia on Moscow? Secondly, and more importantly, really, I basically agree with the Weekly Worker and LLA analysis. But what do we say to the Ukrainian workers? Do we say the same as we would, well, your enemy is at home? And, that really, what more can we do on that question? Thirdly, I just wanted to endorse what Matthew was saying about the viciousness of United States imperialism. I was on holiday for a week in Japan, and I was amazed to find that the United States has an entire island, which is a United States base, and their radio, which is broadcast in English to Japan, is the main, or one of the main English-speaking propaganda stations. But the other thing I really wanted to ask is, why doesn't or can the CPGB and or LLA put out a leaflet with their analysis of this Ukraine war, which we can use in the trade union and labor movement and everywhere, not more than 1 or 2 sides I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a pamphlet, although a pamphlet would also be good. but something that we can reach people with this analysis, because, you know, it's something that on the left is very hotly debated. I just feel it would be so useful. I'm not saying actually print a leaflet. I'm saying draft a leaflet, put it in the Weekly Worker or online, something that people can download on their own computers and print themselves. Because there's such a need for the sort of explanation and understanding that comrades are putting forward. And that's it. Oh yeah, there was one other question, sorry. The existence of Ukraine. So before 1917, wasn't Ukraine just part of the Russian Empire, as opposed to a separate state? And did Ukrainian nationalism, if you like, come about through opposition to control by the Soviet Union? Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Pamela. It's probably unavoidable that we drift into the current war and not so much focus on Marx and Engels, but we'll have to give apologies for Ian if he doesn't know to answer to all of these questions. You do? Okay, go on.
Well, on the question of the history of Ukraine, of course, the first Russian state was Ukraine. Well, the first kind of identifiable republic was Novgorod, but later Kievian Rus, and Kievian Rus was the basis of what subsequently became Russia. The word Ukraine, the root of it is krai, which is the edge, borderland, if you will, which leads some people to say the Ukraine, but of course in Ukrainian and indeed Russian it's Ukraina, and so the implication is it's on the edge of Russia, but actually, of course, it's nothing of the sort. It has a very distinct, identifiable. It's very interesting. I tried to teach myself Ukrainian, and I didn't get very far, unfortunately. A friend of mine who's fluent in Polish found it much more understandable than I did. Just one other thing I wanted to mention about Ukraine is the use of the term Nazi, almost constantly cropping up, both in the context of Russia and in the context of Ukraine. I see that as largely a rhetorical, it's being used as an epithet rather than something which is analytical in any way. I mean, I think Trotsky was absolutely right in talking about fascism in the sense of in Europe, particularly in the parts of Europe that there were where there had been a substantial petty bourgeoisie that was crushed between the hammer and anvil of the haute bourgeoisie and a potentially revolutionary proletariat. There we're talking about fascism. We're talking about Spain, Italy, Germany, this huge petty bourgeoisie which constituted the mass basis of fascist parties. We can't say that's true in Ukraine. There may well be people who adopt, Nazi type symbols or whatever else for whatever dramatic effect. But I remember the same thing being done in Croatia when the Franjo Tuđman adopted paraphernalia associated with the Ustashi regime, the puppet regime that had been established by the Nazis in Croatia, and of course. Who then exploited divisions between Catholic Croats and Orthodox Serbs. But we don't see fascism in Croatia, and I don't think we'll see fascism necessarily in Ukraine. What we will see is authoritarian government. What we will see is brutality against the Russian minority. And what we will see is some kind of example of ethnic cleansing in some places. But having said that, what my experience of having lived in Russia, and unfortunately I've never visited Ukraine, was that Ukrainians and Russians have been intermarried for years, and Zelensky himself his first language is Russian. So I would just avoid this idea that somehow Nazis are just just being used as a kind of epithet against anybody with using a certain sort of symbolism. They might be nasty, they might be brutal, they might be nationalist, but that of itself doesn't make them Nazis.
Also, it doesn't then mean we have to support the other side, because you know, if you have a very loose definition of Nazis, they're Nazis everywhere, certainly in Russia as well. We've got a couple more people with their hands up. Malcolm, please. I believe you've got no camera, so we can only hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Okay, my question is very simple. I guess that most people on this call have never killed anybody, or been in a war killing people, or been in an army killing people. And I haven't either. I was like the last English person alive who didn't have to do national service. So my question is, if you have an insurrection that requires violence, do you think the people who are leading the insurrection, because of their experience with violence, will then subsequently use violence in their new peaceful socialist republic? That's it, really. I mean, I want to know whether, having experienced being a violent person because you think you're on the right side, then, because that must mean something to you. I mean, you've got used to shooting people, whether it's for a good or bad reason. You've got used to shooting people, and somehow that makes it easier to shoot people later on. That's it.
Thank you, Malcolm. Should we take John as well, or do you want to answer this one first?
No,
Go on.
No, take some more. Sorry.
Okay. John, please. John, you can unmute yourself now.
Okay. Hi, thanks Ian for very interesting what can I call it? Yeah, it was very overall.
Oh, sorry, John. Something happened there. Can you try to unmute yourself again? Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry. Apologies.
Yeah,
My
that's
fault.
okay. Yeah, as I say, Ian, thanks for such an interesting talk. I suppose looking at a situation regarding insurrection, you mentioned Allende in Chile, and the situation in Latin America now is that you do have the development of a left in various countries in Latin America. And as you said, the road to parliamentarism, Allende, we saw where that led. But we have seen, an army coming, well, what you would call a citizens' militia coming out to, or I don't think they were actually carrying arms or anything, but to support somebody like Chavez when they tried to oust him. And there is a very peasant, a lot of this movement is made up of peasants and orderly and the working class. And it does seem to me that each time the right, the left get in that position as they have done in Latin America, the right always, bounces back in one form or another. So it's a bit like ping pong ball going on over. And I'm just wondering whether you see there's any kind of possibility of a real insurrection coming about due to the fact that now there are, at this point, a lot of left, movements or government, or whether it's just another parliamentary road to nowhere, basically. You go forward, then you go backwards, whatever. What's important, of course, is that the working class in those countries and the peasants are really experiencing, real poverty. It's interesting you talked about Corbyn and, that project he got. Because part of his project, well, he's always been a supporter of the Latin American left. But again, he's never had that view that workers should take up arms. Well, not at this point. So I'm just wondering what you think about that. Yeah.
The Labour Party had it in its party program, I think, until 1900 something, the workers' militia or people's militia, they called it. But yes, Corbyn has not unfortunately gone that way. Thanks, John. Ian, do you want to reply to these?
Yeah, coming to Malcolm's point, I mean, killing, yeah, I'm pleased to say I've never killed anybody, not yet. And of course, one can't overestimate the effect of the brutalization that war has. Let's just consider a couple of things. The horrors of 1914, 1918 led not only to the Freikorps in Germany killing the revolution in its blood, drowning it in its own blood, but also black and tans brutalized by the experience of World War I, going off to brutalize the US, the Irish population. And let's not forget the massacre at My Lai in Vietnam. How would that be possible that normal people with their own families, with their own children, go in and completely slaughter Vietnamese families, women, children, very few males of military age were even present in the village, and slaughter the lot. The brutalization is a real thing. Of course, very few British people, very few people outside of those countries that have compulsory national service have weapons experience. And that was also true in Ireland, but people learn, and people learn fairly quickly. I'm not wishing to make any kind of particular point about the war in Ireland. We can see there was widespread collusion, for example, between the state and the Ulster Defence Association and various other Protestant paramilitaries. It was a well-trodden path in Northern Ireland to join, for example, the Territorial Army or the Ulster Defence Regiment to get your military training and then put it to the good service of Protestant paramilitaries. As a Republican song used to go, we'll haul down the barricades and call in our sons when 100,000 loyalists hand in their guns. People will have to learn to fight back at some point. I think Corbyn is a pacifist, and I'm not saying there's nothing to be said for pacifism. I mean, one can have a passive resistance, as it were, that doesn't involve violence, and it can be highly effective, as we saw with Gandhi, for example, or any number of other examples that you could mention. But at some point, people will need to fight. My own feeling is, and I'm just speculating, I've no particular experience in that area, that one of the preconditions for world revolution is that the United States of America will at least not intervene to stop it. And that may well require that those US citizens who are armed to the teeth and already organized in militias of one sort or another take a revolutionary stance against their own government to stop that happening. We tend to think of militias as being right-wing, almost deranged, supporting Trump and the like. But at what crucial moment does class consciousness change and people start to recognize that these people who live desperately poor lives within the United States but have access to guns might one day act to at least stop the US state from acting against the rest of the world? It's just a thought. That's it.
Thank you. And the more guns we have and the better prepared we are, the less we actually have to do anything about it, quite possibly. So it's the deterrent as well. we've got nobody else with their hand up, though. John Holiday, you've asked a few questions. I wonder if you actually wanted to come in. If you do, could you put that in the chat? I did want to ask you something about the, you did touch upon it, Ian, sort of in the here and now. Obviously, there isn't a workers' militia, etc. What should our attitude be to, you know, soldiers who are in the army, who have been treated like crap when they leave, etc., underpaid, you know, the lowest, they are often from the lowest parts of the working class, without, you know, often not having any other career prospect, and they're drawn into the army. I mean, some lefties say, you know, we shouldn't, that's nothing to do, they're not workers, they are like police, you know, they are armed wings of the state. But do you think socialists should have a more active approach to the army and perhaps police as well? And how do we split them? You know, you did mention that.
I think we should fraternize at every opportunity, quite frankly. I mean, the British Army is a classic case of the hierarchy of British society. The accents of the officers changes depending upon the prestige of the regiment. It's a fascinating thing to watch. If you have a conversation with somebody who's in the Royal Logistics Corps, you know, these are the people who are the cooks and the drivers and the people who do bomb disposals. The Royal Logistics Corps is a huge part of the British Army, and the accents of the officers there so even the officers are working class. But try having a conversation with somebody who's in the household division. Frightfully, you get this very upper class English accent, and there's a whole, and it's fascinating actually. I used to teach a whole a whole lecture I used to do on military mental health, and of course most British soldiers have reasonably good mental health, and actually even military service isn't bad for your mental health, contrary to popular belief. The big problems is often the case in the army in particular, is vast amounts of alcohol consumption, which has an adverse effect on mental health. So it's not typically PTSD. It's often anxiety, depression, and all the other things that are associated with working class people throughout without society. It was very interesting to look at the figures around after the Iraq War, for example. There wasn't an Iraq War syndrome for very good reasons, and one of the reasons was that they didn't just call up everybody. They took mostly volunteers, and they were very selective about who went. There's a hierarchy within the armed forces. Actually, the best mental health is probably in the Royal Navy. And it's interesting that the Royal Navy, for example, doesn't have any jobs that you can't do. You have to have some qualifications in order to do every job in the Royal Navy. The only job which you can do without any qualifications, something like steward, basically a cook, somebody working in the kitchens. And the same goes for the RAF, apart from the RAF regiment, which is just actually the same way as the British Army. So there's a whole hierarchy there, and none of these people are separated. I mean, yes, of course, people who are a bit more authoritarian, a bit more right-wing, perhaps maybe more inclined to join the armed forces, but it doesn't mean to say they're all right-wingers. Very far from it. And most people's experience, for example, of something like Iraq, was likely to change their mind about things.
What about trade union rights for soldiers?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and the idea that soldiers somehow always reactionary. I mean, the radicalization of the new model army is a good case in point. I mean, here you have a moment where a revolution which is taking place in the 1640s in England in particular finds its way into the army, and the Putney debates are one of the high water moments, as it were, of the English Revolution. Unless something like that happens in the armed forces, and of course it was starting to happen even in World War II, there were the radicalization of soldiers, and one of the reasons why you get this kind of obsessive interest in poppies around Armistice Day is, of course, the Royal British Legion was expressly created to prevent the politicization of veterans.
Interesting.
And I'm very much in favour of the politicisation of veterans. A high proportion of them will end up as homeless.
I mean, World War One would have probably carried on a lot longer if it hadn't been for soldiers who, you know, in Germany and Bulgaria, who not just put down their weapons, but actually turned their weapons on against their own officers and brought the war to an end.
Exactly. And that, in a sense, we have to work on that basis. Because unless we get mutiny, we're not going to get revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So not dismissing soldiers.
Ian, you made a mistake when you say that there were no casualties. Yeah, there were no casualties. This is just an aside now. There were no casualties in Iraq. Casualties. They didn't have any. There are cases going forward now where soldiers have been very badly injured due to different things. But you've got many things going. So they suffered. They didn't not suffer. I know what you were trying to say, but you said that they didn't suffer in the same way, but they did suffer in Iraq. But that's not what I wanted to talk about, anyway. I
just want to draw this distinction between Gulf War syndrome, which happened.
Yes, exactly.
And what happened in Iraq. There were lots of men who came back from Iraq who had PTSD and that kind of thing. But the majority of the mental health casualties that came back from Iraq, and indeed other conflicts, were more to do with anxiety, depression, adjustment disorders, alcoholism, and so on.
No, but they also have this, they're suffering from, I don't know if it's exposure to chemicals or what have you. There's whole cases going forward from Iraq, soldiers from Iraq. But anyway, that I just wanted to correct you, because they didn't not suffer, as you say, in the same way. War is war, and that's why I'm not an outright pacifist, but I do think that we see how horrendous war is, and yet we seem to be saying, well, we'll just do it from our side and it'll be fine. I don't understand that mentality. I can understand that you have to defend yourself, that I understand, but really the point I want to make is war is going to be a different thing nowadays and in the future. War's not going to be the same way that you see war. War is now becoming, I suppose it's becoming more futuristic. The weapons used, drones, so on and so forth. You don't need to have soldiers on the ground anymore. So how does that play out with, if we had, as you say, a citizens' army, or how does that play out? The fact that we're not really taking into account the future and how things have changed. We look all the time back, and I find that very difficult to keep looking back. I understand. I'm a historian. I teach politics, and I'm a historian. So I understand the value of history, but I think to live within that mentality, I think that's flawed. I think we have to look at what's happening now. We see how armies are changing. We see how we don't need people. Yeah, so how would that, do you think, how would we, as if the 95% or the 99% were to be able to rise up?
In terms of soldiers and the nature of war, it's very difficult to predict. So yes, in Ukraine, you've got drones, for example, and I've known people who were, for example, in the Royal Artillery, and their job was not to put big shells into cannons and fire them. Their job was to operate a drone, which could either do range finding for the big cannons, or actually just drop the explosives. And so you don't even need a big gun anymore. You can have a little drone, which is very hard to shoot down. By contrast, a great big gun, AS-80 gun, it can be taken out by an aircraft. So yes, it's changing. But ironically, the current war in Ukraine is being fought with that kind of mixture. On the one hand, it's high tech, and on the other hand, it's hardly different from World War II. And you've got the I mean, who would have thought again there would just be the carpet bombing of cities in order to subjugate entire populations? That's very World War II. What will happen in the future? I have no way of knowing. A war with China? I don't think China could sustain a war with the United States, but I don't think that that's the form that the war will take. I think it will take an economic form in the first instance, rather like the Cold War did, in the sense of we can force China into such a position that it's wasting such a huge proportion of its product on armaments or whatever else, and exhaust it economically. I say we, I'm talking about NATO, the imperialist powers, principally the United States. Do I ever envisage waves of soldiers going over the top to fight the Chinese? No, I don't.
Thank you, Ian. John, please.
Yeah, thanks, Tina, and thanks, Ian, for a very good presentation and covering a lot of topics, and the contributions in the chat, I think, have been very good as well, raising crucial points. I just want to come in on something to do with the last contribution as well from Felicity, not exactly, but thinking about, you know, how often we're going over the same things again and again and taking sides on one side against the other, even amongst socialists and, you know, people on the left side, constantly arguing with each other. What I think is missing from the analysis is any, you know, solution about capital. I've mentioned this several times, but we should be talking about an alternative form of society. These constant conflicts are based on the capitalist mode of production, competing nation states, and we seem to be stuck within that ideology, referred to in previously as reification. I've talked about it in terms of money and wages, but it's also this notion of the nation states, and it's putting us in a position where we cannot think about an alternative. The nation state is the dominant ideology in my view. So quite apart from the effects on the working class, and the whole planet is involved in this, we're facing existential crises if we persist. And Caroline has mentioned this in her contributions as well. The effect on the environment of these constant wars, the constant escalation of these things, have a detrimental effect on the environment. And the environment itself is part of the whole capitalist mode of production. And competing nation states, all aiming for growth and competing an accumulation of capital against each other, place the whole nature of the system at risk, and in fact the whole existence of humanity existence. So what I want to introduce into the discussion, or what I would like to see introduction, is about the nature of the capitalist mode of production, and some imagination about what the alternatives can be. A socialist form of society. We have the basis of it within the capitalist mode of production in terms of a global society. What stands in the way of that is this ideology of nationalism, which is diametrically opposed, in my view, to the notion of class. Class or nation. Rosa Luxemburg summed it up really. There's no war but the class war. That is the important thing. So what I want to introduce, or try and get into this discussion, is some notion of an alternative form of society. Don't take sides within this war. Try and prosecute a notion of socialism, a worldwide society without nation states, so that humanity can not only progress, but even survive. So that would be my contribution.
Thank you, John. And perhaps we can use that, actually, your reply to this, and Ian, as a summing up, because see, I mean, what we've discussed today, what we've discussed over the last few sessions, is of course part of the way how to get to that new society. We've discussed what socialism is in our view, but we also want to learn how to get there. Splitting the army, for sure, a citizen army, you know, towards a citizen army, etc., seems a very good way to get us closer towards socialism. Would you like to sort of sum up now your key findings, perhaps, from tonight's session, and what we can learn as socialists today?
War and destruction is an integral part of capitalism. Just as poverty is a necessary condition for the existence of wealth, the destruction of huge parts of our resources is an integral part of generating more value, as it were. And therefore, John's absolutely right. I think we can't have any more halfway houses, really. I think that the focus has to be upon the abolition of the nation state, the abolition of wage labour and all production to meet human need. War from a socialist point of view can only really be a war of defence, but also of the necessity for defending ourselves and expropriation of the expropriators. Easier said than done, of course, but I think the study of war and the study of Marx and Engels on war, I mean, I set about it with the aim of preparing this, but the more that I read, the more that I felt I needed to read about that. Somebody mentioned the idea of a pamphlet. I mean, pamphleteering is an interesting art form in itself, and of course Marx and Engels did quite a lot of pamphleteering, and it's something that perhaps we do need to think about. I'm not, by the way, a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but I'm close to Weekly Worker and so on. But if I was to sum it up in one way, it's socialism or barbarism, and at the moment it's looking like barbarism if we're lucky, but we need to keep fighting. And even if it's doing the hard yards of precisely these sorts of meetings and talking to people and writing pamphlets and whatever else, that's what we have to do. There aren't any shortcuts, I'm afraid, and I wish it was possible to say all we need to do is set up this or that organization and Bob's your uncle, but it isn't working. So but I remain an optimist, and I remain an optimist because when things change, they change very quickly, and we'll see it.
Thank you very much, Ian. I love that fact, and I'm sure I might have mentioned it once or twice, but just before the Russian Revolution, a few weeks before the Russian Revolution, Lenin was saying about what a shame he won't be alive when the Russian Revolution happens, because it looked like a total, not a possibility at all. And bam, sometimes things can change very, very quickly. And certainly the situation that it is globally today with climate catastrophe, etc., the threat of World War III certainly does require the working class to get its finger out. And we're making a small contribution, we're hoping, learning lessons from the past to shape the future. Thank you very much, Comrade Ian. Next week, we're doing the final session before our summer break. Myself and Rob Gold will be looking at Marx and ecology, another very, very important question that a lot of people think Marx didn't have much to say about. He did, Engels as well. Looking forward to seeing you then. Good night, comrades. Bye-bye. Thanks, Ian.